Welcome to the Reimaginers. My name is Matt Couts, and I'll be one of your hosts for this limited web series. The Reimaginers seeks to provide a historical perspective on the idea of reimagining education. Since school buildings close and students move to remote learning spaces, there have been many calls to reimagine education. Some have used this opportunity to pursue unjust educational reforms. The waves of protests following the police murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd are a reminder of how past reforms have remade or created new inequalities. It is for this reason we want to turn to the past to explore how has schooling been reimagined in the past, who has done that reimagining, for what purposes, and with what results. So to help navigate these histories, I'm joined by my co-host, Christina Martin. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you.
Christina, do you mind sharing a little bit about yourself and why you were interested in participating in this series?
So I am a recent high school graduate, and I'm going into my freshman year of college for psychology and African American studies at LSU. And I was interested in this series because of my majors, and I want to spread knowledge of other people's experience in the world.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad that you're here with us and helping to do that. Today, our guest is Dr. Robert P. Robinson, who recently earned his PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center. Dr. Robinson's dissertation frames the Black Panthers Oakland Community School as a convergence of Black self-determination, Black education history, and curriculum studies. In his dissertation, he demonstrates how the school's history provides examples of educational practices like restorative justice and culturally relevant pedagogy that the school used long before they became popularized educational discourse, or in the educational discourse today. Today with us, he'll share some of that history. So Dr. Robinson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Robinson. Can you give us a brief overview of the Black Panthers Oakland Community School?
Yes. So the Black Panthers Oakland Community School comes about in the tail end of the Panthers development as an organization, as a community organization, a political organization, as an activist collective. And so the Black Panthers actually were disturbed by the way children were being treated in everyday public schools. And so in 1970, they create a house called the Children's House, which was actually a safe haven for elementary school children who were being harassed by their public school teachers. And so that happens in 1970. In 1971, they create a more established full-time day school that looks closer to something we see as a traditional school. And so that opened in 1971, and it's called the Intercommunal Youth Institute. And they have about 50 students, but they're mostly the children of Panthers. And by 1973-1974 school year, they move locations to East Oakland, and they become the Oakland Community School. And that iteration of the school lasts from 1973 until 1982. And so the Oakland Community School becomes a way to provide access to high quality education, not just for the children of Panthers, but also for the children of the students in the community, the children of people in the community. And so you have about 50 to 60 students who are children of Panthers, and then the other 100 or so students are children in the East Oakland community.
So in reading your work, one of the things I was really struck by was two educators, or reimaginers, if you will, and that was Elaine Brown and Erica Huggins. Can you just kind of describe who they were and how they changed pedagogy at the OCS, and what were the impact of some of these changes?
Yes, thank you for that question. So Elaine Brown was actually the chair of the party when the Oakland Community School was established. So Elaine Brown was chair for roughly 2 years. And so during this time, she has also run for new city council of Oakland. She's also been actively engaged in the political climate, the educational political climate of Oakland. And so she's helping to organize with the teacher strike in 1972 and 1973. So very engaged in the Oakland community. She is the chair of the party when the actual shift goes from the Intercommunal Youth Institute until the school becomes the Oakland Community School. So she's very much interested in really delving into critical thinking for children. Erica Huggins is the director of the school. And so this dynamic duo kind of see themselves as part of the development of the school, as well as a part of the integrated conversation around education in Oakland and in the broader Alameda County, or should I say East Bay community. And so Erica Huggins was huge about providing holistic education. She used phrases like teaching the students how to think, not what to think. She talked about providing a combination of freedom and structure. She saw students as co-creators of knowledge and not just passive learners. She actually tried to steer students away from being replicas of Black Panther Party leaders, and actually invited them to think and live and breathe on their own terms. And that became the culture of the school itself. And so they're huge because we think about the Black Panther Party as being a very large masculinist organization, whereas the women are doing a ton of the legwork and the theorizing work that we see in relationship to how curriculum is developed and implemented.
So from what you've learned from the Black Panther Party's Oakland Community School and how they approach education, how do you think the politics of your school differs from other schools of the time?
Great question. So when we think about the politics of schools at the time, as we saw, students were being harassed by some of their teachers. So we see schools attempting to operate as if they're apolitical, whereas the reality is that they were actually, operating on different politics, and those became the points of contention. I think we also see, when we're looking at the Oakland Community School, in relationship to Oakland, the prevailing theme is that these kids cannot be educated, right? So first off, these kids being the phrasing, but also saying that they cannot be educated is kind of some of the language that's going on in different parts of Oakland. But at the same time, you do see the Oakland community attempting to do more work, specifically the Black residents of Oakland. There was a search for a superintendent in the early 1970s, and the coalition of Black parents and community organizers got together to establish their own search for a Black superintendent. They said, look at the demographics of Black children who are in schools and look at the number of white staff members. And so they were really pushing for a Black superintendent so that community voices would be heard in these large conversations about education. I think politically, there's also this idea that is still sadly prevalent in education today. I think we're pushing it a little bit more, or revising a bit more, but the idea that, students come in kind of like as blank slates, and it's our job to directly pour information into them, presuming that they're not thinking, breathing, politicized entities. And so think of students less as passive consumers of knowledge and thinking about them as active participants in the knowledge creation process is something that wasn't just revolutionary during the time, but sadly enough, it's still a thing that we have to push for in the present day.
How does the Oakland Community Schools curriculum compare to those schools in today?
So thinking about one concept that I'm concerned about, or not concerned about, one comparison is the conversation around restorative practice that entered education today around 2012, 2013. And so when we think about restorative justice and restorative practice, these things that we don't always remember are that these are indigenous practices that we see within North America, but they're also practices that we've seen on the continent of Africa, especially in different West African nations. And so thinking about this idea of something old being reintroduced to something new, devoid of kind of like this trajectory of how it's been operating within particular communities over time. And so the cool thing about the Oakland Community School is that they have this restorative justice model with children, ages 7. I think the earliest you can be in the justice court is around 3rd grade. So from 7, 8 until middle school age. And so thinking about how children are thinking about ways to hold each other accountable, thinking about how they're going to engage around the community principles, thinking about how they show different ways of love in action in these communal spaces, I think are huge. I think what also is happening at the time is, again, critical thinking skills and context-specific learning. And so when we talk about today, like the shift in Common Core is kind of like less these discrete practices in separated disciplines, and thinking about how the disciplines converge. I think the context under which the Oakland Community School is operating is integrating these concepts in real time. So students are going to the grocery store to learn about mathematics. So they're learning how to read signs, to go to the stores. They're learning about the socio-political history of the store. So which stores have been, down for the Panthers cause, and which stores are more committed to a traditionally consumer capitalist vision. And then they're also learning how to count change and exchange in the same context. So one trip to the store becomes 3 lessons at once. And so thinking about how disciplines don't operate in vacuums or silos, but how they're a part of a larger vision, I think that's a huge thing that the Panthers are providing at that time. And we see bits and pieces of it in practice today, but not always within the context of the communities in which students live.
I want to follow up because you had mentioned the justice court, and I think that's really kind of one of the innovative things. And right now there's so much conversation about getting police out of schools. And part of that also has to be reimagining a discipline system that still doesn't exclude children for, what's often minor transgressions or things that are really subjective when teachers are doling out that kind of punishment. And so can you just explain more, like, what was the justice court? How did it operate? And how did students understand their relationship to it?
The students were ages, like I said, 7 to around 12 to 13, depending on, how old the kids were. And they were designed, or the justice court was designed to be fully run by the students. So there was an adult facilitator in the room, but the adult's job mainly was to think about, like, just to be present so that they were available to chime in at any given point. Rodney Gilead, who's a former teacher at the school, he talks about how, it was some of the things were trial and error. Children were trying to figure out, what things worked, what types of potential like correctives that they could provide to help students to move forward. And he says, they didn't get it right. It wasn't perfect. But when we think about any type of quote unquote justice system, when is it ever? But the difference is, instead of this external group of adults, right? So it's so trusting were the parents and the faculty members of students that they allowed them to be the rule makers and to be, well, not so much just the rule makers, but like to be the negotiators of what the rules look like in action for children. And that's a very different model than contemporary schools where, like Matt mentioned, in which cops, security staff, these large personnel. I'm going into New York high schools all the time. And, sometimes it was just like a couple of schools had metal detectors and other schools did not. This year, every high school I went into, I had to run through the security check. And so thinking about schools as being a space that's constantly under surveillance by some external force, right? But we look at the Oakland Community School as a space where the children are thinking about what safety looks like. The adults are thinking about what safety looks like. Parents are thinking about what safety looks like. And so when the school is run by the community, there's less of an external threat and there's less of an internal threat, because the idea about the justice court is, and all ideas of the school is, all people in the community are holding each other accountable, right? And so what does it look like for us to create that type of environment for children and for families? I don't know if that answers the question. No problem.
No, I think what you really highlight kind of in that answer is, one, like trusting students, and then empowering them to make decisions and really define, what does justice look like? How do we understand how we operate and connect with one another? And I think that's something that's really powerful that needs to be part of these conversations of not just getting police out of schools, but also thinking about what are the disciplinary structures in schools that we're removing to then trust students and allow them to navigate the world for themselves.
And I think it's also tricky when we think about the notion of discipline, the phrasing itself. Like we talk about discipline policies in schools, it's automatically moving from a punitive standpoint. It's operating as if we're preparing for the students to do something that needs to be fixed or corrected or punished. And so even moving from the language of discipline, I think is a huge conversation we should be having when we're reimagining our future of schools.
Wow. So just taking from like just a behavioral standpoint into more even just classrooms and how the classroom works and runs. How might the Black Panthers School help us think about reimagining education in this moment? And how does the change in ideologies from this is what you need to believe into here are the facts, believe in what you want, relate to the changing in schools today?
Thank you. I think thinking about reimagining the future, I think coming back to the idea of like, here are the context, here are the facts from varying perspectives, and how are you going to contribute is like the seamless thread that runs through the justice court, but also runs through the curriculum. And I think that is a huge factor we need to take into consideration. I was in a panel recently, and I argued that we're missing the political agency of high school students. Some of those are not just high school, all students. You know, some of the protests I've been in, I've seen, you know, young children with their parents to like middle school and high school children, but I've also seen young adults who, one of the marches that crossed from Manhattan to Brooklyn, at the front of that line were high school students. And so students are already agentic, they're already politicized in this moment. And to take that and leverage it as a way to think of them as part of the co-curricular process, I think is huge in this current political moment.
And so as we wrap up the episode, I just kind of want to build off that point about thinking about the political agency of students. And Christina, you've just graduated from high school amidst a pandemic where everything kind of went online. And in some ways, you're part of the generation that came of age with Black Lives Matter. And so as you're thinking about, you know, the Oakland Community School, and you're thinking about, you know, how you would reimagine education, what are some of the things that you're thinking about?
Well, for me, it's a bit different than the typical African American, because I have an immigrant mother and an immigrant grandmother, so who came from two different islands in the Caribbean. So growing up, schooling was very strict. I had to, you know, go through that, and like just the stark difference of how I was raised versus my siblings and the way school is. Like for me, I didn't have to go an iPad to go on. I couldn't watch TV until all my homework was done. I couldn't go outside to play, versus now my sister does her homework. And it's like, how does this, and it's a game. Like, how does this game teach you simple math or multiplication? Like that to me is kind of weird, especially in this day and age where we have the big divide between primarily minority schools versus primarily white schools, where a lot of these, unfortunately, Black students don't have the access to the technology, especially from what we learned from the Black Panthers of you learn through everyday things. I think the education has strayed from that to the point of you're learning to take this test and to pass this test to get on to the next level, to then go on to college just to have a mediocre job when you didn't really learn anything. And so I think what really needs to go back to is thinking about just the core of why we want kids to learn, to have a better life than the previous generation, to make it better for the next generation to come up. And I think we've really lost that. And so if we really need to look back, especially now that kids aren't going to school and we have this big debate of whether or not school should start in the fall, we should be taking this time to really look back at what are we teaching kids and how are we teaching them.
Yeah. I think that last point that you made is exactly right. And I think, you know, Dr. Robinson, you provided a great way for us to think about that. And Christina, I also thank you for sharing your thoughts, because I think it's also helpful to get a student perspective thinking about what's been lost, especially when all all education is really done on technology right now. So thank you both for joining and providing this insight. For those of you watching, please join the conversation by sharing your ideas with us on social media about how you might reimagine education, and make sure that you tune into our next episodes as we continue to explore how the past might provide possible pathways for the future. You've been watching The Reimaginers with Christina Martin, Robert Robertson, and myself, Matthew Kautz. We'll see you next time.